My name is Celeste Morrow. I am 37 years old. And on a Tuesday morning in March, I walked into the 43rd floor boardroom of Crestwood Capital Partners in uptown Charlotte, North Carolina, set my leather portfolio on the chair at the head of the conference table, looked up, and watched my father's face go the color of old chalk. He had been mid-sentence. Something about integration timelines, his reading glasses halfway down his nose, a legal pad in front of him, a coffee cup he had not yet touched sitting to his right. He was one of 11 people already in the room. He was the one I had been thinking about for 6 years, 2 months and 4 days. He saw me and his mouth stopped moving and the sentence he had been forming simply ceased to exist. The way sound stops when the power goes out. My brother Garrison was seated beside him. I watched Garrison's eyes track from my face, across the table, to the gold-edged placard that the Crestwood administrative team had placed at the head of the table exactly 41 minutes before I arrived. The placard that read, in clean black serif type, Celeste Morrow, Chief Executive Officer, Crestwood Mid-Market Division. I sat down. I opened my portfolio. I uncapped my pen. "Good morning," I said. "I'm Celeste. I'll be leading this division going forward." I looked around the room, past the senior Crestwood partners, past the acquisition lawyers, past the 3 consultants I had personally hired the previous autumn. I looked at my father. His mouth was still open. I looked at my brother. His face had gone completely still, the way faces go still when the brain cannot yet produce a response because it is still attempting to verify what the eyes are reporting. "I believe some of you know me," I said. "And some of you think you do." I did not smile. What they didn't know was that I had been building this for exactly 6 years, 2 months, and 4 days. This is that story. My father, Raymond Morrow, was 64 years old and had spent the last 23 years as a founding partner at Aldridge and Morrow Partners, a mid-size financial consulting firm headquartered in South Park, Charlotte, that worked primarily with regional manufacturers and distribution companies. He was not a famous man. He was not a wealthy man by the standards of the Myers Park neighborhood he had chosen to live in for the past 32 years, but he was a man who understood, with a kind of deep constitutional certainty, the social currency of appearing to be exactly the right kind of person. Everything in his life, the house, the car, the dinner parties with the correct wine, the stories he told about himself in rooms he considered important, was organized around that principle. My mother, Patricia Morrow, was 61 years old and ran a small interior design practice out of a studio she had built above the garage in 2004. She had a warm manner and a loyal client base, and she had spent the better part of 3 decades measuring the health of her own contentment by the opinion of people who did not particularly deserve that power over her. She organized dinner parties at which the napkins were folded in a specific way she had read about in a magazine. She volunteered for 2 charities she mentioned often and funded at a level that was considerably less consequential than the frequency with which she mentioned them. She had a gift for making social conversations feel deeply personal right up until you needed something real from her, at which point the warmth would remain, but the substance would quietly disappear. My brother Garrison was 40 years old. He had a Master of Business Administration from the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania, which my mother had framed. Not his diploma. The acceptance letter. She had taken the letter out of the envelope when it arrived on a Friday afternoon in November of 2005, driven it to a frame shop on Providence Road the following morning, and hung it in the hallway between the kitchen and the dining room so that every person who came through the front door would walk past it on the way to dinner. Garrison worked at my father's firm where he had been made senior partner at 36. He drove a black Range Rover that he replaced every 3 years. He had a wife named Courtney who organized charity galas, and a 4-year-old daughter named Presley who appeared in every family photograph wearing a bow. My parents spoke about Garrison the way other people speak about weather, constantly, and as though it had a direct bearing on everyone present. And then there was me. I had studied business administration at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, not Wharton, not Duke, not Wake Forest, UNC Charlotte, which is a perfectly good school that my parents treated like a polite but unfortunate outcome, the conversational equivalent of a B- in a subject you were supposed to excel in. I graduated with honors in 2009. a 3.8 grade point average, and a minor in data analysis that nobody in my family asked about. I went to work for a commercial property management company called Greystone Facilities Group, where I worked as a project coordinator managing vendor contracts, lease structures, and operational efficiency for 12 commercial buildings across the Charlotte metropolitan area. I was good at my job. I understood numbers at a cellular level, the way they hid things and revealed things, the way a discrepancy in a quarterly report could tell you more about a company than a year of executive meetings. I understood how organizations wasted money without realizing it, and exactly what would have to change to stop. My parents understood none of that. What my parents understood was that their daughter worked for a company with the word facilities in the name, and that on one specific afternoon in the spring of 2012, they stopped by my office building unannounced on their way back from a lunch that had apparently ended early. They found me on the lower level near the service entrance, in practical clothes with a hard hat tilted back on my head, directing a crew of maintenance contractors who were replacing a section of HVAC ductwork while I simultaneously negotiated a revised cost schedule on my phone. The total savings I was arguing for in that phone call was $11,200. I got $9,000 of it. My father looked at me from the lobby side of the glass entrance for exactly 3 seconds. He said, "We'll wait upstairs," and he turned around and went back to the elevator. That evening at dinner, I heard him on the phone in the kitchen, speaking to his brother Richard in a voice that was not quite quiet enough. "Celeste is doing some kind of facilities work, buildings and maintenance. You know how she is." He said it the way you say something when you are ashamed of it but not willing to admit you are ashamed. So the shame comes out sideways, shaped like casualness. I was 26 years old. I heard every word. I ate my food and I did not correct him. What I did not know until much later was how far that particular sentence had traveled. I found out in pieces, the way you find out most things about your own family, secondhand, in fragments, always at the wrong moment. My cousin Brianna told me first. It was the 4th of July, 2013, and we were on my parents' back porch, and she was 2 glasses of Pinot into a warm evening, and she said, with the casual delivery of someone who assumed I already knew, "You know Aunt Patricia told Kathy Delmore at book club that you managed the cleaning crew for a corporate building." She said it just like that, the cleaning crew. Brianna watched my face. "I thought you should know." I thanked her. I went inside and washed my hands at the kitchen sink for longer than was strictly necessary. 2 years after that, at my parents' anniversary party in the summer of 2014, I overheard my mother standing near the fireplace with a woman I had never met. A friend of a friend in a green silk dress who had asked politely what I did for work. Before I could open my mouth from across the room, my mother said, "Oh, Celeste? She manages a corporate building. You know, the maintenance staff, the cleaning crews, the contractors. It's useful work." She said useful work with the particular inflection of someone closing a door that had been accidentally left ajar. The woman in the green silk dress nodded politely and the conversation moved forward, and my mother never looked in my direction. 2 Christmases after that, in December of 2016, my father gave Garrison an engraved watch. A Patek Philippe, silver face, brown leather strap, presented on a velvet cushion in a dark box with a small card inside that read, "To my son and partner." A man who carries the Morrow name well. I was sitting 4 feet away. I had been handed an anthropology candle, $42. I know because I had been in that store 2 weeks earlier looking for a gift for a friend, and had seen the same candle on the shelf and registered the price. I held the candle in both hands. I looked at it. I set it on the table beside me and I smiled and I said it smelled wonderful. And something that had been hardening in my chest since I was 26 years old, finished hardening completely. That was the moment I stopped being the daughter who was waiting to be acknowledged, and started becoming the woman who decided to make acknowledgement unavoidable. The night that moved me from hardening quietly to building deliberately arrived on a Saturday in November of 2017. I was 31 years old. My parents were hosting a dinner party for 12 people, which meant I had been at their house since 2 in the afternoon helping my mother press linens and arrange flowers and polish the silver she brought out for guests. By 6:30, everyone had arrived, and I was in my usual seat, the one at the end of the table nearest the kitchen, the one with the table leg that made it uncomfortable to sit with both feet flat on the floor. which was my seat because it was the seat that was easiest to get up from when something needed to be cleared or refilled. Frank Aldridge was there. Frank was my father's business partner. A tall man with white hair and the unhurried confidence of someone who had never once in his adult life worried that the room was not interested in what he had to say. His wife Margaret sat beside him. Across the table were the Hendersons from the tennis club, whose daughter had just been accepted to Columbia Law. There was also a couple I had not met before, David Chen, who my father explained was a mid-level partner at a private equity firm called Crestwood Capital Partners, Charlotte-based, mid-market focused, and David's wife Andrea, an orthopedic surgeon with a very direct gaze and the short answers of someone who is always the most competent person in any room and has made peace with that. During the salad course, David Chen turned to me with an open, curious expression and said, "And what do you do, Celeste?" Before I could draw a breath to answer, my mother said, from the other end of the table, in the smooth, redirecting tone she had been using my entire life, "Oh, Celeste manages a corporate building. Facilities." She waved her hand lightly, as though describing something both obvious and unremarkable. "It's behind-the-scenes work. Very useful." And then she turned to Andrea Chen and asked something about orthopedics, and the conversation shifted and David Chen smiled politely and turned back to his own food. And the subject of me was closed. I sat with my fork resting against the rim of my plate. I did not cry. I did not say a word. I finished my dinner. I helped clear the plates. I declined dessert. I drove 40 minutes back to my apartment in Plaza Midwood, and I sat at my kitchen table and I stayed there until 2:17 in the morning. I had a yellow legal pad in front of me and I wrote down everything I had built in the past 3 years that no one at that dinner table had thought to ask about. The vendor contracts I had renegotiated at Greystone, saving the company $940,000 over 2 fiscal years. The operational efficiency model I had designed from scratch, which had since been adapted for use across 3 additional properties in the portfolio. The 6 months of side consulting work I had been doing. 3 clients. Small businesses who needed someone to look at their operational costs and identify where they were hemorrhaging money without knowing it. The 14 months of notes I'd been keeping about a company I was going to build. Not someday. Soon. I wrote for 2 hours. Then I went to sleep. 3 weeks later, on December 9, 2017, I gave notice at Greystone Facilities Group. I spent the following 6 weeks building a business plan that was 44 pages long. And on January 22, 2018, I registered Meridian Advisory Group, LLC, in the state of North Carolina. The opening balance in the business account was $12,400. It was every cent I had saved in 3 years. I did not tell my parents. The first thing I did was call every person I had worked with at Greystone who I believed would hire me as an independent consultant. 3 of them said yes within the first 2 weeks. By the end of February 2018, I had 4 paying clients, a monthly retainer total of $9,200, and a calendar that required me to be in 3 different offices before noon most days. I worked from my kitchen table. I had a printer, a laptop, a phone, and a folder system that my best friend Diane Ashworth, who had graduated from UNC Charlotte 1 year ahead of me with a finance degree and was now a CFO at a mid-sized technology firm, described as, and I am quoting her exactly, "the most organized thing I have ever seen in a private residence." My parents knew I had left Greystone. My mother had called when I told her. Her voice, when I said the words "I resigned," had gone flat the way it goes flat when something unexpected and unwelcome arrives. "Left? Celeste, why on earth? What are you going to do?" I told her I was starting a consulting practice. There was a silence on the phone that lasted 4 full seconds. "Consulting," she said, in the way you say a word in a foreign language you don't quite trust. "What does that mean exactly?" I told her it meant that companies paid me to analyze their operations and find efficiencies. She said, "Well, as long as you're being careful with money." Then she asked if I had enough for rent. I said yes. She said she had to go. She was meeting a client. We hung up. 3 weeks after that, I ran into my Aunt Lenora at the Harris Teeter on Providence Road. Lenora was my father's older sister, 62 at the time, a retired school principal, and the one person in the Morrow family who had always asked me questions and then waited long enough to actually hear the answer. She hugged me in the coffee aisle. She said she had heard I left my job. I said yes. Good for you, she said, and the way she said it, without the cushioning, without the cautionary tone my mother would have wrapped around those words. I had to look at the floor for a moment. Your father told Richard you were between things, she said. Don't let him describe your life. Then she squeezed my arm and went to find her coffee. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 6 minutes thinking about those 4 words. Don't let him describe your life. It was the most useful thing anyone in my family had said to me in years. By June of 2018, Meridian Advisory had 7 clients. Monthly retainer income had reached $22,800. I had hired one part-time analyst, a 24-year-old named Priya Nair who had just finished her degree in industrial engineering at NC State, and who, within 3 months, was doing the work of someone with twice her experience. I'd moved out of my kitchen and into a shared office suite on North Tryon Street, a glass-door room with a white table and 2 chairs across the desk, and enough wall space for the small whiteboard I had used since the beginning. I paid $900 a month for that office, and every other dollar went back into the business. My parents continued to introduce me at family events as Celeste, who does facilities work. I let them. I was 32 years old, and I had decided that the quieter I was about what I was building, the less interference I would have to navigate. There is a particular and underappreciated freedom in being underestimated. People do not monitor you carefully when they have already decided on your ceiling. They do not question your hours or your income. They do not ask what you are working on. They simply assume and stop looking up. I used every inch of that overlooked space. In the autumn of 2019, a referral came through Diane. A regional packaging manufacturer in Concord, North Carolina, called Westbrook Manufacturing, had been bleeding money in their supply chain for years and could not identify the source. The CEO, a man named Gerald Holt, had been given Diane's card at a conference, and Diane had given him mine. The engagement was 90 days. The fee was $47,000. It was the largest single contract Meridian had ever signed. I drove back from that first meeting, pulled into my driveway, and sat in my car for 6 minutes. Then I texted Diane one sentence. They said yes. She sent back 11 exclamation points. That was our entire celebration. I found the source of Westbrook's supply chain problem in 3 weeks. A vendor routing inefficiency that had been producing a 23% cost overlap for 4 straight years, camouflaged inside the accounting structure in a way that made it invisible unless you pulled 3 specific reports simultaneously and cross-referenced them against the vendor master. Nobody had done that before because nobody had thought to look for it. I presented the findings on a Tuesday afternoon in October in a conference room with 5 executives and Gerald Holt at the head of the table. He looked at the report without speaking for almost 3 full minutes. Then he looked up. How long to fix this? 90 days, I said. You have 60. Name your fee. I named a number 40% higher than what I had planned to say. He said yes without negotiating. I drove home that evening and updated my rate card. By January of 2020, Meridian had 11 active clients. Annual revenue had crossed $980,000. I had 2 more analysts on staff. I had moved into a proper office on the 4th floor of a building on South Tryon Street, 2,200 square feet, a glass-walled conference room, a waiting area, my name on the suite directory. I installed the office sign myself on a Thursday evening with a small level and a drill I had owned for years. The wall behind my desk looked exactly the way I had imagined it while I was sitting at my kitchen table in January of 2018. 3 days after I hung that sign, my parents called to invite me to Garrison's promotion dinner. He had been made managing partner at Aldridge and Morrow Partners. Raymond said it the way he always said things about Garrison, with a warm current beneath the information, as if even the facts about his son were something to be proud of simply by association. I went. I brought wine. I sat in my usual seat. I watched my father give Garrison the handshake that means more than words. I drove home at 10:43 that night, opened my laptop, and added a column I had been putting off adding to my revenue spreadsheet. Exit valuation. I had been thinking about it for 6 months. Meridian was built on operational consulting. The unglamorous, high-margin work of making organizations function the way they were supposed to. It was not a flashy business, but it had a client retention rate of 91%, which is the number that tells a private equity firm everything it needs to know. Once companies hired me, they almost never left. That kind of recurring retained revenue has a very specific value in acquisition conversations. And I had been watching one acquisition firm in particular since the night of my parents' dinner party in November of 2017. Crestwood Capital Partners. David Chen had mentioned Crestwood in passing at my parents' dinner table, and I had gone home that night and looked them up. What I found was a Charlotte-based growth equity firm that made acquisitions in the mid-market space and had an operational division that was visibly underperforming relative to its peers. I had read their portfolio reviews. I had tracked their acquisitions. I had developed a theory over 2 years of watching them from the outside. What they needed was not more capital. They needed someone who understood operations from the inside. Someone who could take their underperforming mid-market portfolio companies and fix the specific, granular, unsexy dings that were preventing growth. Not a consultant they would hire for a project. A division leader. I did not reach out to Crestwood until March of 2021. By then, Meridian's annual revenue was $2.1 million. I had 15 employees. I had a track record across 38 clients in 6 industries. I compiled everything into a presentation, not a pitch deck but an operational thesis, 41 pages, and sent it to Marcus Webb, the managing partner of Crestwood's mid-market division, with a single paragraph cover note I wrote in 11 minutes and revised once. He called me 4 days later. It was a Wednesday morning at 8:53. He said, "Ms. Morrow, I've read your document 3 times. I'd like to meet." We met at his office on March 19, 2021. 2 cups of coffee were already on the table when I arrived. We spoke for 2 hours and 40 minutes. I left with a handshake and a preliminary term sheet pending due diligence. The acquisition of Meridian Advisory Group by Crestwood Capital Partners was finalized on October 8, 2021. The purchase price was $4.6 million. 3 months before that closing, my father had been at a barbecue at my Uncle Richard's house in Huntersville. Aunt Lenora told me about it on the phone the following evening. My father had apparently told the group, while standing by the grill with a beer in his hand, that Celeste was still doing some small building management work, and a little bit of this and that, building management work. I had been running a $2 million advisory firm for 3.5 years. I had 15 employees. I had been in the middle of acquisition due diligence with a private equity firm. My father had a beer and told people I managed buildings. Aunt Lenora said he had said it without a single trace of irony. She said she had looked at him for a moment, the way she used to look at students who had said something spectacularly wrong in class. And then she had gone inside to refill her drink. She called me that evening. She said just 2 words, "Keep going." I said, "I intend to." The acquisition closed in October of 2021. I was appointed Vice President of Operational Strategy for Crestwood's mid-market division. I signed a standard confidentiality agreement as part of the deal. I spent the first 8 months inside the portfolio, learning the companies, meeting the teams, identifying the precise operational inefficiencies that had been invisible to everyone who had not spent years training themselves to look for exactly this kind of thing. I worked from an office on the 39th floor. My salary was $220,000 plus equity participation. I ate lunch at my desk most days. I did not mention any of this to my parents. At Christmas that year, I told my mother I was doing some strategy work for a financial firm. She nodded and asked if Garrison had told me about his new client in Raleigh. I said he had not. She spent 7 minutes telling me about it. In May of 2022, Marcus Webb called me into his office and told me the current CEO of the mid-market division was stepping down. The board had been quietly discussing succession for 4 months. He had put my name forward. I asked what the timeline was. He said 60 days for a recommendation, 90 for the formal appointment. I said, "Tell me what you need from me." He said, "Nothing. I already made the case." I drove home with both hands on the wheel and the radio off, and the particular internal steadiness that comes when something you have been building toward for a long time is finally close enough to touch. If you are still watching this right now and you feel what I felt in those years of building quietly, while people described me as a janitor, I want you to drop a comment below with the one moment you were most underestimated in your own life. And if you have not subscribed yet, do it now. because every story on this channel is about what happens when a woman stops explaining herself and starts building instead. The next one is worth staying for. Now here's the part that nobody in that conference room on the 43rd floor knew on the morning of March 14th, 2 months before my appointment as CEO was formally confirmed by Crestwood's board. Crestwood's acquisition team finalized the purchase of a mid-size financial consulting firm that had been struggling with client attrition and a shrinking revenue base for the past 3 years, a firm that had lost 4 of its 10 largest accounts in 18 months. A firm that my father had been quietly trying to sell for the past year, accepting a lower valuation than he had hoped. Because the books had deteriorated and the options were narrowing, Aldridge and Morrow Partners, Crestwood, paid $2.2 million for it. My father believed he was joining the Crestwood portfolio as a senior advisor, that he would keep his name on the door and consult for the division he had just been folded into, and that the new CEO of that division was someone he had never met. He had no idea that the new CEO had been sitting at his dinner table for 37 years. The announcement of my appointment was scheduled for 9 o'clock in the morning on March 14, 2023. The 43rd floor boardroom of Crestwood's main tower had been set for 11 people, 4 senior Crestwood partners, 2 members of the acquisition team, 2 outside lawyers, 1 external consultant, my father, and my brother. They had been told this was the initial integration meeting for Aldridge and Morrow's absorption into the mid-market division. They had been told the division's new leader would be introduced. They had not been told who she was. I arrived at 8:41 that morning. I took the elevator to the 43rd floor. I wore a charcoal wool blazer, black trousers, and low block heels. No jewelry except small silver stud earrings. My hair was down. I had been awake since 5:17 and I had eaten breakfast, and I had driven to the building with the radio off, which is what I do when I am very calm. I am always most calm when the thing I have been preparing for is finally arriving. The Crestwood administrative team had set the room. There were placards at every seat. At the head of the table, where the light was best, where the chairs were angled slightly inward, where every person seated in the room could see without turning their head, Celeste Morrow, Chief Executive Officer, Crestwood Mid-Market Division. I stood at the window for a moment. The uptown skyline below me, the streets already moving, the March light coming in flat and clear off the glass buildings. I set my portfolio on the chair at the head of the table. I checked my phone. 8:57. I stood and waited. They came in clusters. The Crestwood partners first, whom I knew. Nods, handshakes, quiet morning conversation. The lawyers and the consultant. And then, at 8:59, my father and my brother. Raymond Morrow walked through that door the way he had always walked into rooms he considered important, with the slight forward tilt of a man who expected to be the most knowing person in any given space. He had a leather portfolio under his arm and his reading glasses in his breast pocket, and the composed, subtly superior expression I had watched him wear my entire life. The expression that said he had assessed the situation and found it familiar. Garrison was beside him in a charcoal suit and a blue tie, his phone in his hand, still reading something on his screen. I was standing near the whiteboard at the front of the room in a quiet conversation with Marcus Webb. My back was half turned to the door. I heard them enter. I heard my father's voice offer some easy pleasantry to Marcus's assistant. And then there was a pause. That specific pause, the kind that happens when recognition and context have not yet agreed on what to do with each other. I turned around. My father saw me. I watched his expression move through 3 distinct phases in under 2 seconds. The first was recognition. The second was confusion, because recognition had arrived, but understanding had not yet followed. And the third was something I had never seen on Raymond Morrow's face in 37 years. Something that looked, stripped of all the other interpretations, very much like fear. Garrison looked up from his phone. His eyes moved from my face to the placard at the head of the table. He read my name. His face went completely still. "Good morning." I said it to the room. Steady. Even. The same voice I had used in every boardroom for the past 5 years. Nobody in the room who didn't know the history would have heard anything in it except professionalism. Marcus Webb moved to the front of the room and opened the meeting. "Thank you all for being here. I'd like to begin by formally introducing the new head of Crestwood's mid-market division, who will be overseeing this integration and all strategic direction going forward. Many of you will be working closely with her in the months ahead. He looked toward me. Celeste Morrow. I stepped to the head of the table. I placed both hands flat on the surface and I looked at the room. I covered the integration timeline first. The 60-day operational review, the client account reassignment structure, the team consolidation framework. I covered revenue projections for the next 3 quarters. I outlined the operational assessment model I intended to apply across the full portfolio. I answered 2 questions from the senior partners without hesitation. I redirected one conversation that was drifting toward a topic that could wait. I spoke for 44 minutes. At no point during those 44 minutes did my father speak. His legal pad sat in front of him, and his pen sat beside it, and he did not write a single word. He looked at his hands. He looked at the table. Once, near the end, I allowed myself one deliberate glance in his direction. He was looking at me with an expression that I have spent time trying to name accurately. It was not shame exactly, it was not pride. It was something between the two. The expression of a man who has just fully understood that the story he has been telling about someone for years was not the true story, and that the true story was much larger, and that he had been telling the false one in front of witnesses repeatedly and with complete conviction. Garrison did not look at me for the duration of the meeting. When it ended and people gathered their things and the room filled with the low, polite sound of post-meeting conversation, he stood, put his phone in his jacket pocket, and walked to the door. He left without speaking. My father was the last person in the room. He stood by the door after the others had gone, his portfolio under his arm, his glasses back in his pocket. He said my name, Celeste. Just that. The way you say a word you have said 1,000 times and have suddenly, without any warning, become uncertain about what it means. I was gathering my own things at the head of the table. I looked at him. I'll have my assistant reach out this week to schedule time, I said. There's a lot of ground to cover on the integration. I said it exactly as I would have said it to any other person in that room. Measured, professional, forward-moving. I did not make it personal in front of the remaining staff. I did not give him anything he hadn't earned. He nodded once. He left. I stood alone in the boardroom for 90 seconds. I looked at the placard with my name on it. Then I picked it up, set it in my portfolio, and walked to my office. The call started that evening. My mother called at 6:48. She had spoken to Raymond, who had called her from the Crestwood parking garage at 4:30 in the afternoon, which I know because Aunt Lenora happened to be at my parents' house when the call came in, and she phoned me afterward with a careful, thoughtful summary. When my mother's voice came through the line, it was stripped of the social polish it usually carried. Not cold, just bare. The warmth was still there, but the performance had gone out of it. "Celeste," she said, "why didn't you tell us?" I was at my kitchen table. The same one I had been sitting at 6 years ago with a yellow legal pad. I had changed out of my work clothes. There was a cup of tea in front of me. The window was open, and the evening was mild. "Tell you what, Mom?" I said it gently. I genuinely wanted to hear what she thought she had been owed. She was quiet for a moment, then about the company, about what you built, about everything. Her voice broke slightly at the end of that sentence. Not into tears exactly, but into the edge of them. And it was the first time in my life I had heard my mother's voice sound like that on the phone with me. "You didn't ask," I said. "Not once. Not in 6 years." I said it calmly, without heat, the way you state a fact that has always been true and has simply never been said out loud. Every time I came to dinner, every holiday, every family event, you and Dad talked about Garrison's clients and his car and his promotion, and when anyone asked about me you said Celeste does something with buildings. You said it in front of Frank Aldridge. You said it in front of the Chens. You said it to women at book club. I know what you told people, Mom. I've known for years. I let that settle between us for a moment. I wasn't hiding, you were just not looking. She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice had the slightly uneven quality of a sentence that has been rearranged at the last moment. "We're proud of you," she said. "I want you to know that." "I know," I said. And I meant it. I believed her. She was proud of me now. Now that there was something with a title and a company and an acquisition figure to point to, something visible and legible and impressive in the specific language her world spoke, that was the part I sat with in the days that followed. Not with bitterness, but with clarity. She was proud of the proof. She had never been curious about the process. And the process? The 4 in the morning spreadsheets. The $12,400 that was every cent I had saved. The $900 a month office. The years of being invisible in their rooms so I could be undisturbed in my own work. That was the part that deserved the interest, long before there was any title to give it. My father came to my office 3 days later. My assistant brought him to the conference room at 11 in the morning, and I came in with 2 cups of coffee. I set one in front of him and sat across the table and waited. Raymond Morrow is not a man who finds apology natural. He is a man who has always believed that directness is a virtue, except when the directness would require him to say something unflattering about his own choices, in which case he becomes expansive and contextual and the apology gets buried under so much framing that you have to dig for it. He spoke for 4 minutes about the integration, about what was going to be different, about the fact that he had not known the full picture. And then, in a single sentence that arrived quickly and without ceremony at the end of all of that, he said, "I misjudged you. I said things to people that weren't fair. I should have paid attention." 11 words. He picked up his coffee after that and looked at the window, and I could see in the line of his profile that those 11 words had cost him something real. I did not need more. I did not need the extended version, the full accounting of every family dinner, every phone call, every moment at which he had chosen the story that was easier over the one that was true. I needed only for him to know that he knew. And now he knew. "I appreciate that," I told him. "I mean it. Because here is the thing I have spent a considerable amount of time understanding about the people who underestimate you. They are not always cruel people. They are often people who built a story about you very early, for reasons that had more to do with their own unresolved fears than with your actual capacities, and then they never went back to revise it. My father needed Garrison to be the evidence that the choices he had made, the firm, the particular kind of ambition that equates credentials with character, the idea that worth is something you signal outwardly rather than build internally, had been the right choices. I was the inconvenient counter-argument, not because I was better than Garrison, but because I had found a different way, and he had never wanted to look at it carefully enough to understand what it was. Garrison sent a text 3 weeks later. 3 sentences, congrats on the appointment. Impressive what you built. I knew you were working on something. I read it twice. He had not known I was working on something. He had sat at multiple family dinners and talked about the operational consulting market as crowded and low margin, while I was building a firm in that exact market. He had once described Meridian's direct competitors at one of those dinners by name, without knowing I was one of them. He had been 2 seats away from me when he said it. I texted back thank you and meant approximately 60% of it. That was honest and it was enough. I want to say something now to anyone watching this who recognizes their own life in what I have described. Anyone who has sat in the wrong seat at a dinner table, been answered for before they could speak, been handed the candle while the watch went to someone else, been introduced at a party as the one who does the useful work. I want to say this carefully because it matters. The story other people tell about you is not a description of what is true. It is a description of what they need to believe about you in order to continue believing what they believe about themselves. My parents needed me to be small because a different version of that story required them to look at their own choices differently. So they chose the version that was easier. They chose it over and over again in front of person after person until I think they genuinely believed it. But here's what I know with absolute certainty. Their story did not slow my story down by a single day. It ran alongside it in a different room, completely unaware of what I was building. And while they were describing me as a janitor at book clubs and barbecues, I was at my kitchen table at 2 in the morning with a yellow legal pad, and then in a $900 office on North Tryon Street, and then in a suite on South Tryon with a sign on the wall, and then in an acquisition meeting with a $4.6 million outcome. And none of that required their belief, not one step of it. The loudest comebacks are not the ones where you raise your voice. They are the ones where you sit down at the head of the table and open your portfolio and say, "Good morning." I'm Celeste. I'll be leading this going forward. If you are sitting somewhere right now inside someone else's smaller version of your life, if you are the overlooked one, the useful one, the one they wave away with a hand and a sentence about building maintenance, I want you to hear this. The space they leave you by not watching is not a limitation. It is a gift. Build in it. Build quietly and build well, and let what you build be the only answer you ever owe them. What would you have done in that boardroom moment? When you looked up and saw the face of someone who had spent years telling the world you were nothing, how would you have handled the next 44 minutes? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one, and I am genuinely asking. Before I let you go, I want to say something directly to every person who has found this channel and stayed. You came here because something about this kind of story speaks to something real in your own life. I know that because I read your comments, and they are not small. They are full of years. What we try to do here, every single week, is tell the story of a woman who was written off with the care and the detail and the quiet dignity that her story deserves, not to celebrate revenge, not to celebrate anger, but to celebrate the particular discipline-requiring, unsexy, daily courage it takes to build something real while the people who should be watching are looking somewhere else. If that is you, if any part of today's story made you feel seen, please subscribe. Leave a comment so I know you were here. Share this with someone who has been sitting in the wrong seat for too long. There are more stories where this one came from, and every one of them is for you. We will see you next week. Thank you for being here.